How's it going, Skullbrains? Welcome to another episode of Skullbrain TV, and in this episode, we dive into book number 5 of the Ancestral Trail.
When he who is the chosen one shall tread upon the ancient path and battle there to overcome
the forces of the dark.
The Ancestral Trail, an epic story of myths, magic, and monsters. Book 5, Boltor, Bird of Thunder, Air Attack over Desert Wastes.
In the last issue, our heroes finally recovered their first life force pod. They met one of the guardians of the Ancestral World, Julek, and they also found themselves plummeting to their untimely demise. So, let's find out what happens. But before we do, have you seen the Ancestral Challenge for this video? If not, you can check it out here. Go and see what hidden objects you need to look for and what monster and magic card the villain of this book is based on. And then come on back and join in the fun. Let's do this.
On the 5th day, a flight through air to withered land, beware the storm the desert spanned. A bone-filled grave awaits the brave, but hidden bounties save. Within dark earth a lonely night, from skyborn spite at dreadful cost, a hard-won treasure now is lost.
Each of the three felt a sickening lurch as they plummeted into the abyss. Wind roared in their ears as they sped faster and faster towards the ground. One moment, Richard saw the misty depths for which they were heading. Next, he saw outlined against a dark sky the ridge from which they had fallen, and behind it he saw a bird-like shape speeding towards them. Then there was a thump. His chest felt as if it were gripped by iron bands. He looked down and saw huge, yellowed, horny fingers around his ribs. To his right, he could see Orkin and Melik slumped limply within a giant fist. The three companions were still in the air, but they had been saved from their plummeting spiral. Then Richard felt a tickling on his skin. He looked up and saw feathers ruffling above him. His vision doubled, and he blacked out. When he came to, Richard was on solid ground in a flat, hard desert dotted with spiky cactus plants. Nearby, Melik and Orkin rubbed their eyes groggily. Above Richard towered a giant bird. "Don't be afraid," the bird said. "I know who you are. My name is Oganga. I am a friend. Like your companions, I escaped from the final battle, and I have been searching for survivors." He paused, then added sadly, "There are not many of us." "There are more than you think," Orkin broke in. "We've just come from the City of Stone. Julek is free." "I know. I have just left him," Oganga said. "But he and his troops were in trouble and fighting for their lives." "What?" Richard was horrified. "It all seemed fine when we left." "Things were far from fine when I came along," Oganga said, shaking his head. Then he told them what had happened. Giant earwig soldiers armed with sharp black pincers had marched on the city. Julek and his troops had fought them as they poured through the gates. By the time Oganga had arrived, there were dozens of corpses around Julek's feet. Yet more soldiers came to take their place. "Why didn't you stay and help?" Richard asked, furious at Oganga. "I did, for a bit," Oganga replied, "but Julek urged me to leave. He told me to catch up with you three because your mission was more important than his. Lucky I took his advice." "Yes, thank you," Richard said, realizing that he had yet to thank Oganga for saving his life. Orkin and Melik also mumbled their gratitude. Oganga nodded and said, "It's best to be on our way now. I'll fly on ahead to make sure it's safe." Oganga took to the air and the three moved off in the same direction on the ground. As they walked, Melik read aloud from the Book of Prophecies. Richard shuddered when the dwarf reached the last line. A hard-won treasure lost? Richard repeated under his breath. Had he got the pod back just to lose it again so soon? He would have to be on his guard. On the horizon, the clouds were dark and flashes of dry lightning tore up the sky. Once, a fireball shot from the sky and came bouncing across the ground towards them. When it passed near him, Richard felt his hair rise with the electric charge it carried. Then it careened away, leaving singed stones and a smell of burnt sand in its wake. They pressed on across the dry wastes. Cocking his head to one side, Orkin asked suddenly, "What's that?" Then Richard and Melik heard it too. A harsh roaring noise over a distant rumble and thud. They spun round to face a low bank of red cloud rolling above the horizon. At centre stage was the ominous black funnel of a tornado. It was spitting up sand at its base and drawing huge rock into a spiralling height. They watched in horror as it sped towards them, a narrow twisting rope that snaked from side to side like a giant whiplash joining earth and sky. "We've got to get underground," Orkin said urgently. "It's our only hope." "But where? There's nowhere to go," Melik wailed in despair. "Over there," Richard pointed. "There's a small gully behind that line of scrub. It'll have to do." They ran desperately. Behind them the roaring grew in strength, and a fierce wind buffeted their backs. The three threw themselves into the hollow and curled up in tight balls on the ground. A blast of hot air and stinging sand tore angrily at the trio. The noise was deafening. Then the tornado was over the bank and into the gully. Melik and Orkin disappeared from sight as if snatched by a giant hand. For a split second, Richard found himself staring up into the heart of the tornado, a dark, dreadful tunnel that led to the heavens, its sides dotted with whirling lumps of stone and vegetation. Then he too was spinning helplessly, up and up, towards the evil ochre sky. Meanwhile, unaware of the devastation behind him, Oganga had flown far ahead to the mountains that bordered the desert. Suddenly he spotted movement below, and wheeling silently on his gigantic wings, he spiraled down to investigate. Oganga found a group of battered birds huddled together on a ledge. He recognized them immediately as the Outriders who had flown in his squadron during the final battle. The unit had been savaged. The birds were all wounded, and one, Oganga reckoned, would not live more than a few days. The birds poured out their tales of woe to Oganga. They told of injury and of flight, and of the difficulty of hiding in a land now filled with enemy eyes. One tale drew Oganga's attention. A badly scarred bird had heard that a life force pod was hidden in the mountain lair of Enlil, a vicious bat-like creature in the Evil One's power. Enlil kept an army of slaves, and the bird had learned about the pod from an escaped prisoner. Before an execution, Enlil had taunted his victims with the pod and bragged that it would never be recovered. Oganga then told his old comrades about Richard and his quest. "I must go back and tell them where the pod is. Good luck to you all," Oganga said, reluctant to leave them so helpless. He took to the air and flew fast to tell Richard his news. His heart sank when he saw the tornado's track twisting across the desert. Rising high into the sky to increase his field of vision, Oganga began to quarter the land in a methodical search. As Oganga sped through the skies, the trio were finding their bearings. Their journey with the tornado had taken them far into the desert before the storm had finally stopped, stranding them in a remote spot. The windspout must have faded gradually, Richard thought, letting them down gently. Had it collapsed in mid-flow with its burden still high in the air, they would have been splattered across the toasted landscape. Richard now found himself in a shallow depression filled with skeletons, the remains, he guessed, of a terrible battle. Nearby he saw Melik and Orkin heave themselves awkwardly from a crackling mass of bones. As Richard walked towards the others, the heat beat at him in waves. He was amazed at how much he had been able to endure so far. But unless they found water soon, he thought they would die of thirst or be roasted alive. "We're lucky," Orkin said when Richard told him of his fears. "Look over there." Through the heat shimmer, Richard saw a stand of spiky cactuses. Using his sword to split them open, Orkin revealed white watery pulp behind the prickles. As the three sucked out the liquid, they heard a pulse in the air. It was Oganga hurtling towards them. He came in fast, sending out clouds of sand as he landed. "At last," Oganga said with relief. "I've been searching everywhere for you." He listened as they told him about the tornado, marveling at how well the three had come through their ordeal. Then he told them his good news. "I have to warn you," Oganga finished. Enlil is not alone. He has a wife, Erna. She is just as vicious as Enlil, and very greedy. They live in a dying volcano whose fires are constantly replenished by teams of slaves. They never let their possessions out of their sight. The pod will be watched night and day. You can count on that. It doesn't matter, Richard shrugged. We have to recover the pods wherever they are. If Enlil's got one, we have to get it back, that's all there is to it. Then I'd better take you there, Oganga said, as he seized them in his massive talons and took off. They soared high into the air, rising in slow circles on the hot desert winds. Then, when Oganga judged the altitude to be correct, he banked and shot towards the mountainous horizon. The hazy peaks of the Wolfkill Mountains grew gradually nearer and nearer. Soon they were gliding softly and with skillful elegance between the heavily wooded slopes. We'll stop at the next peak, Oganga said, skimming smoothly over a saddle in the hills. We could all do with a rest. As he rose above the valley, there came a raucous screeching and the sky filled with menacing, hook-beaked shapes. Sky pirates, Oganga exclaimed, swerving quickly one way then the other. They are vultures who don't even wait until their prey is dead before they go in and start to feed. Don't worry, we'll soon lose them. Yet despite his strength, Oganga was unable to evade his attackers. The weight of Richard, Orkin and Melik slowed him down too much. I'll have to land, Oganga said, having dodged and curved in vain through the hills. They're still on our tail, brace yourselves. Oganga came in fast and shallow over a scree-laden slope, releasing the trio just before touchdown. As they sprawled harmlessly across the rocks, the huge bird landed just beyond, in an untidy skid that sent a clatter of rubble rattling down the hill. The vultures, caught off guard, peeled upwards in neat formation to regroup. They massed in preparation for their next strike. Then a much larger bird rose high above the group. As it spread its great shadowy wings, a bolt of lightning shot out from its sharply curved talons. The bolt streaked towards the three companions, but missed and singed a nearby outcrop. This is worse than I thought, Oganga said, recognizing the vulture's leader. That is Boltor, bird of thunder. His powerful thunderbolts can kill from a great distance. You must get under cover fast. You're not safe here out in the open. Leave me to fight him in the air. I know his tricks, and I've got a few of my own. Now go and hide, quickly. As Oganga flew into battle, Richard clutched Golan's amulet. Immediately he sensed the Guardian's voice telling him to look across to a red bush. A low tree covered in fiery berries was hugging the ground to his right. This way, Richard shouted, plunging towards the tree. Orkin and Melik followed just in time to see Richard disappear through a small crevice that lay hidden beneath the tree's roots. They wormed in after him and found themselves in a den. It must have been inhabited at one time because a well-sooted fireplace stood in the middle of the floor, surrounded by a sprinkling of tiny bones, leftovers of many an ancient meal. Whoever had lived here was long gone, but the den provided a safe refuge for the three companions. There was no way their pursuers could follow them in here. Huddled in their hideaway, they watched Oganga soar majestically against the dark, rusty sky. He circled slowly above Boltor, then swooped down faster than an arrow. Boltor flipped backwards and jagged bolts of pure energy shot out from his talons. A loud explosion rent the air and lightning flashes lit up the sky. Then Oganga tore down at the bird of thunder. Two steel blue feathers whizzed at Boltor. A second later, Oganga's powerful talons were digging deep into his enemy's breast. The bird of thunder gave an ear-splitting screech, and the two birds plummeted out of sight. The three waited for a while, then Orkin broke the silence. Let's get some sleep, he said. There's nothing we can do. One of us can stand guard to keep an eye out for Oganga. We'll take it in shifts, starting with me. Richard and Melik needed no prompting. They were exhausted from their travels. They moved back into the den, and soon the air was filled with the sound of deep breathing. Orkin sat cross-legged by the narrow opening. He secretly doubted whether they would ever see Oganga again. Nobody could survive the sort of odds that had been stacked against the great bird. Then a small sing-song voice broke into Orkin's thoughts. Before the sun, before the moon, the days like thunder run. By 26 the time is up, all evil will be done. It was Melik talking in his sleep. Orkin turned and stared at his wizened companion. The words meant nothing to him. He turned back to his vigil. Time passed slowly and he wondered how long he should wait before waking one of the others to take his place. He stretched out and made himself comfortable. Waking with a start, Orkin was horrified to find that he had nodded off. Rising to his feet, he peered cautiously out of the den. There was no sign of any birds. He ducked back inside and went to wake Richard and Melik. While they rubbed sleep from their eyes, Orkin outlined the situation. He also repeated Melik's midnight ramblings in the hope that one or the other would be able to cast some light on their meaning. Richard shook his head. Well, it sounds like one of the prophecies. We'll just have to wait and see what it means, though. The important thing now is the quest. If Oganga has not returned, there's no point in waiting here. For all we know, he could be dead. I think we should move on. The trio stepped out onto the hillside. Around them lay the signs of a fierce battle. Feathers littered the ground. The rocks were splattered with dried blood. On the topmost crags, patches of fresh stone showed where Boltor's thunder had exploded away from its target. Even the sky was a baleful shade of red, yet there was no sign of any bodies. Richard was appalled at the ferocity of the battle. Let's hope Oganga is safe, he said. Then he set off along the slope, Melik and Orkin scrambling in his wake over the loose pebbles. Richard decided that it would be safest if they roped up using the length that Melik still carried with him. The further they went, the steeper the slope became. Now, the rope was invaluable, as they helped each other down the most difficult stretches. They were taking the most direct downhill route they could find, but even so, the wooded valley bottom seemed as far away as ever. The three were inching along a narrow ledge towards what looked like an easier way down when Melik lost his footing. He scrambled desperately for a handhold, but in vain. He fell out into space. Richard just had time to shout a warning for Orkin to hang on tight. Once again, the rope showed its true worth. Bit by bit, Richard and Orkin hauled Melik back to safety. Then, just as his fingertips grasped the ledge, there was a snap, and the Book of Prophecies tumbled away down the mountain. It spun through the air, bouncing off the hillside in high, arching leaps. Then it was gone from sight. Finally, a distant thud signaled that the book had come to rest. But where it might have landed was anybody's guess. And that is the end of book number 5. So, how did you go with the Ancestral Challenge? Were you able to find all of the hidden objects? And who do you think Boltor, the Bird of Thunder, was based on? Tune into the next Ancestral Challenge where I will give you the answer. And don't forget, in the pinned comment below, you can find a link to download this week's map pieces that came with issue number 5. So, until next time, stay tuned and stay skull-brained.